The year was 2157, and New Seoul wasn't just a city. It was a tower of lights that reached into the clouds. On the 47th floor of Building 2187, in a small apartment that smelled of coffee and old books, lived Mr. James Washington. He was probably the oldest person alive in the city, though few people knew this truth. Mr. Washington sat in his favorite chair by the window, watching the endless stream of flying cars zoom past his apartment. His dark hands, still strong despite their age, held a real paper book, something rare in this digital age. The book was about the Vietnam War, and he didn't need to read it. He had lived it. At 208 years old, Mr. Washington was a living piece of history. But thanks to the life extension technology that the government had given to Vietnam veterans in 2080, he looked like he was only 65. His black skin was barely wrinkled, and his gray hair was just starting to show. He kept himself fit and strong, walking straight and tall, unlike many actual 65-year-olds in the city. The morning sun reflected off the silver buildings outside his window. Mr. Washington put down his book and walked to his small kitchen. As he made his morning coffee, real coffee, not the instant stuff everyone else drank, his special military-grade eyes zoomed in on the street far below. These eyes were another gift from the government, along with many other improvements to his body that most people didn't know about. "Time for my morning walk," he said to himself, putting on his old-fashioned jacket. He didn't need it for warmth. His enhanced body could handle any temperature, but he liked how it felt. It reminded him of simpler times. The elevator ride down was quick and quiet. In the lobby, the cleaning robot beeped a greeting. "Good morning, Mr. Washington," it said in its friendly computer voice. He nodded back, just like he would to a real person. Being polite was important, even to robots. Outside, New Seoul was already busy. Flying cars filled the sky lanes above, while on the ground, people hurried to work. Some walked, while others rode on moving sidewalks or electric scooters. Mr. Washington preferred to walk the old-fashioned way. His first stop was always Mrs. Han's corner market. Mrs. Han was one of the few people who still ran a real store instead of using delivery drones. She was a kind woman in her 60s who reminded Mr. Washington of his own mother, even though she was much younger than him. The store's door chimed as he walked in. "Mr. Washington." Mrs. Han called out from behind the counter. Her face lit up with a warm smile. "I saved your favorite tea. The real kind, from actual plants." "Thank you, Mrs. Han," he said, walking to the counter. "How's business?" Mrs. Han's smile faded a little. She looked around to make sure no one else was in the store. "Not so good," she whispered. "Some young men came yesterday. They said I need to pay them money to protect my store, but I think they're the ones I need protection from." Mr. Washington's enhanced hearing picked up the slight tremor in her voice. His special eyes noticed her increased heart rate. She was scared, and she had good reason to be. "These young men," he said carefully. "What did they look like?" "3 of them," Mrs. Han said, her voice getting even quieter. "The leader's name is Ko Daho. He has a red cybernetic arm, one of those fancy new models. The others call him Boss. They said they'll come back today." Mr. Washington nodded slowly. He had heard about Ko Daho and his gang. They were causing trouble all over this part of the city, using their cybernetic improvements to scare people. But their new technology was nothing compared to his military-grade enhancements. "What time are they coming back?" he asked, putting his tea in his jacket pocket. "They said around noon." Mrs. Han wrung her hands nervously. "I called the police, but they're too busy with bigger crimes. They said they can't help with simple extortion cases right now." Mr. Washington looked at the old-style clock on the wall. "It was 11:30 a.m., Mrs. Han," he said. "Would you mind if I stayed and had my tea here?" Relief showed on her face. "Of course. Please, sit at the counter. I'll get you a cup." As Mrs. Han prepared his tea, Mr. Washington sat at the counter, facing the door. His enhanced senses were already scanning the street outside. He could hear conversations from 50 feet away, and his eyes could zoom in on faces in the crowd. He wasn't looking for trouble, but if trouble came to Mrs. Hand's store, it would find him ready. The next 20 minutes passed quietly. Mrs. Hand served other customers while Mr. Washington sipped his tea. Some customers nodded to him. He was a familiar face in the neighborhood. Everyone knew him as the quiet old man who liked books and tea. Nobody knew about his military past or his enhancements. At 11:55 a.m., his enhanced hearing picked up 3 sets of footsteps approaching. They had a particular sound, the heavy steps of people who wanted to be heard, who wanted to scare others. His eyes zoomed in through the store window. 3 young men were walking toward the store, led by a tall one with a shiny red cybernetic arm. Kodaho and his gang had arrived. Mr. Washington didn't move from his seat. He just kept sipping his tea, his enhanced systems quietly analyzing the thugs. Their cybernetic improvements were new and flashy, but they were civilian grade, nothing like the military hardware hidden beneath his own skin. The door chimed. Mrs. Hand's hands shook as she put down the cup she was cleaning. The other customers quickly paid and left, keeping their heads down. Mrs. Han. Kodaho's voice was loud and fake-friendly. I hope you have our protection money ready. His 2 friends spread out in the store, trying to look threatening. One had silver cybernetic legs, and the other had visible neural implants that made his eyes glow blue. They were probably in their early 20s, playing at being tough guys. I don't have much money, Mrs. Hand said, her voice trembling. Business is slow. Kodaho's friendly smile disappeared. That's not good, Mrs. Han. Not good at all. He looked around the store, his cybernetic arm whirring as he clenched his fist. Maybe we need to show you what happens to businesses that don't pay for protection. He reached for a container of expensive tea on a high shelf. Mr. Washington knew it was Mrs. Hand's most valuable item. Young man, Mr. Washington said quietly, not turning around. I suggest you put that back. The store went silent. Kodaho turned slowly, seeming to notice Mr. Washington for the first time. Well, well, he said, grinning. What do we have here? An old man trying to be a hero. His friends laughed. The one with the glowing eyes walked closer. Hey, old-timer, this isn't your business. Why don't you finish your tea and walk away? Would be a shame if something happened to you. Mr. Washington finally turned around on his stool. He looked at each of them carefully, his enhanced eyes recording everything about them. Their stance, their cybernetics, their weak points. I'm making it my business, he said calmly. Mrs. Han is a good person. She doesn't need your kind of protection. Kodaho's face darkened. He put down the tea container hard enough to crack it. Listen, old man, he growled, walking toward Mr. Washington. I don't care who you are. This is our territory now, and you're starting to annoy me. Mr. Washington didn't move. He just sat there, calm as could be, looking at the young man with the red arm. Territory, he said softly. Son, I was fighting in jungles before your grandparents were born. I've seen territory disputes that would make your head spin. This isn't territory. This is just bullying. And I don't like bullies. For a moment, Kodaho seemed surprised by the old man's lack of fear. Then he laughed. Fighting in jungles. What are you talking about, old man? You're just some crazy. His voice trailed off as he got closer and saw Mr. Washington's eyes. Eyes that suddenly didn't look quite human. Boss, the one with the glowing eyes said, look at his hands. They're not shaking. Old people's hands always shake. Kodaho's cybernetic arm whirred as he raised it threateningly. Who are you? He demanded. Mr. Washington stood up slowly. He was shorter than Kodaho, but something about the way he moved made the young man step back. I'm just an old man who's seen too many bullies in his time, he said quietly, and I'm giving you one chance to walk away. Take your friends, leave Mrs. Han alone, and we can forget this happened. Behind the counter, Mrs. Han watched with wide eyes. She had never seen this side of Mr. Washington before. Kodaho's face turned red with anger. "Nobody threatens me in my territory," he shouted. His cybernetic arm transformed, the hand splitting apart to reveal the built-in plasma cutter. "An illegal weapon. I'm going to teach you a lesson, old man." Mr. Washington sighed. Some lessons, it seemed, had to be learned the hard way. His military implants were already analyzing the situation, calculating angles, predicting movements. These young thugs had no idea what they were about to face. The air in the store crackled with tension. Outside, people hurried past, pretending not to see what was happening. Inside, 3 young cybernetically enhanced thugs faced one old man who didn't seem afraid at all. Kodaho raised his plasma cutter arm. "Last chance, old man. Get out, or this gets ugly." Mr. Washington looked at Mrs. Han and gave her a reassuring nod. Then he turned back to Kodaho and said something that made all 3 thugs pause. "Son, I've been ugly since Vietnam, and I haven't gotten any prettier." The plasma cutter in Kodaho's cybernetic arm hummed with dangerous energy. The sound filled Mrs. Han's small store, making the tea containers on the shelves vibrate slightly. But Mr. Washington didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his enhanced eyes tracking every tiny movement of the 3 young men. "You think you're tough, old man," Kodaho sneered. "Your generation is obsolete. We're the future." He swung his plasma cutter in a wide arc, showing off its deadly glow. Mr. Washington watched the weapon move with mild interest. His military-grade neural processors were already calculating trajectories and analyzing weak points in Kodaho's cybernetic arm. The plasma cutter was impressive, but its power source was poorly shielded. Amateur work. "The future," Mr. Washington said quietly, "should learn from the past." His voice was calm, but something in it made the thug with the glowing eyes take a step back. Kodaho didn't notice his friend's hesitation. "Learn this," he shouted, lunging forward with his plasma cutter. The weapon sliced through the air where Mr. Washington's head had been a split second before. But Mr. Washington wasn't there anymore. Moving with a speed that seemed impossible for someone his age, he had shifted to the side. His movement was smooth, efficient, and completely silent. No wasted energy, no flashy cybernetic displays, just pure military-grade precision. "What the?" Kodaho started to say, but he didn't finish his sentence. Mr. Washington's hand shot out and grabbed Kodaho's cybernetic wrist. His grip was like steel. Kodaho tried to pull away, but he couldn't move his arm at all. The plasma cutter sputtered and died. "First lesson," Mr. Washington said, still speaking in that calm voice. "Never attack in anger. Anger makes you sloppy." The thug with the silver cybernetic legs jumped forward to help his boss. His enhanced legs let him move fast, but Mr. Washington's military systems had already calculated his attack path. Without letting go of Kodaho's arm, Mr. Washington simply stepped aside and stuck out his foot. The silver-legged thug went flying across the store, crashing into a display of instant noodles. The packages exploded around him like colorful confetti. "Second lesson," Mr. Washington continued, as if nothing had happened. "Fancy equipment doesn't make you a fighter." The 3rd gang member, the one with the glowing eyes, pulled out a shock baton. His neural implants flickered rapidly as he tried to analyze Mr. Washington's fighting style. But the old veteran's movements didn't match any known combat patterns in his database. "Your neural implants won't help you, son," Mr. Washington said, looking at the confused young man. "Some things can't be learned from downloads. They have to be earned." Kodaho was still struggling to free his arm. His face had turned red with effort and embarrassment. "Who? What are you?" he gasped. "Just an old soldier," Mr. Washington replied. Then he moved. His actions were so fast that Mrs. Han, watching from behind her counter, could hardly follow them. One moment, he was holding Kodaho's arm. The next, the gang leader was lying on the floor, his expensive cybernetic arm making strange clicking sounds. The shock bacon user was slumped against a wall, his glowing eyes dimmed. The one with silver legs was still tangled in instant noodle packages, not trying to get up. Mr. Washington stood in the middle of the store, not even breathing hard. He straightened his jacket and turned to Mrs. Han. "I apologize for the mess," he said politely. "I'll help you clean up." Mrs. Han stared at him with wide eyes. "Mr. Washington, how did you?" Before he could answer, Kodaho started to push himself up from the floor. His cybernetic arm hung useless at his side. "You'll regret this, old man," he spat. "Do you know who I work for?" "The Red Dragon Syndicate will." "The Red Dragon Syndicate," Mr. Washington interrupted. He walked over and looked down at Kodaho. "Son, I've been fighting dragons since before your grandfather was born. Real ones, in the jungles of Vietnam. Your syndicate doesn't scare me." He reached down and helped Kodaho to his feet. The young man flinched but didn't pull away. Maybe it was fear, or maybe it was the strange gentleness in the old warrior's touch. "Your arm isn't permanently damaged," Mr. Washington said. "I just disabled the power coupling. Any decent mechanic can fix it, but before you go getting it repaired, think about something." He turned Kodaho around so the young man could see Mrs. Han, who was still watching from behind her counter. "That woman works hard every day. She helps people. She makes this neighborhood better. What do you do? What do you build? What do you protect?" Kodaho didn't answer. His face showed confusion where arrogance had been just minutes before. "Your cybernetics make you strong," Mr. Washington continued. "But strength without purpose is just bullying. And bullies," he smiled slightly. "Well, bullies eventually meet someone stronger." The thug with the glowing eyes had managed to stand up. "Boss," he said nervously, "maybe we should go." Kodaho looked at his useless arm, then at his defeated friends, and finally at Mr. Washington. The old man's eyes seemed to look right through him, seeing past his cybernetics and his tough guy act to something deeper. "Yeah," Kodaho said quietly. "Yeah, we're going." He started walking toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Mrs. Han, I'm sorry about your noodle display." Mr. Washington watched them leave. The bell above the door chimed as they stumbled out into the street, trying to maintain what dignity they had left. Through the window, he could see them hurrying away, Kodaho's red cybernetic arm hanging limp at his side. Mrs. Han came out from behind the counter. "Mr. Washington," she said softly, "all these years, I never knew." "Not much to know," he replied, already starting to pick up scattered noodle packages. "Just an old soldier trying to keep the peace. But your moves, your strength, you're enhanced, aren't you? Like them?" Mr. Washington nodded. "Military grade, part of a program for Vietnam veterans. They gave us a choice back in 2080. Take the enhancements or let time take its course. Most of us took the offer. Seemed better than dying. There are more like you. A few. Not many of us left now." He paused in his cleaning. "Most people think the Vietnam War is ancient history, just something in books. But for some of us, well, let's just say some wars never really end. They just change shape." Mrs. Han touched his arm gently. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for today. For being here, for watching over us." Mr. Washington smiled. "It's what soldiers do, Mrs. Han. We protect people, even after the war is over." He looked at the mess of noodle packages on the floor. "Now, about this cleanup." But Mrs. Han was already heading to the back room. "First," she said firmly, "you're going to sit down and let me make you a fresh cup of tea. Real tea, not this instant stuff. And maybe you could tell me more about being a soldier, about Vietnam." Mr. Washington looked at the chair by the counter, his usual spot. It seemed like a good place to sit and talk about old wars and new battles, about duty and honor and protecting what matters. "I'd like that, Mrs. Han," he said. "I'd like that very much." Outside, New Seoul continued its busy day. Flying cars streamed overhead, robots cleaned the streets, and people hurried past, with their cybernetic enhancements glinting in the sun. But inside Mrs. Han's store, an old warrior sat down to drink tea and share stories of a time when wars were fought in jungles instead of city streets, and soldiers didn't need cybernetics to be heroes. The bell above the door chimed as customers started coming back in. They had seen the whole thing through the windows, and word was already spreading through the neighborhood. The quiet old man who liked books and tea was something more. Something from the past, yes, but also something that this bright, cybernetic future still needed. A protector, a teacher, a veteran. Word spread quickly through New Seoul about what happened at Mrs. Han's store. Within 2 days, everyone in the neighborhood knew about the old black man who had defeated 3 cybernetically enhanced gang members without breaking a sweat. But Mr. Washington didn't care about the attention. He kept to his usual routine, reading his books and taking his daily walks. On the 3rd morning after the incident, Mr. Washington was drinking his morning coffee when his enhanced hearing picked up unusual movement in the street below. He walked to his window and looked down. His military-grade eyes zoomed in on a group of people gathering outside Mrs. Han's store. They weren't gang members this time. They were ordinary people from the neighborhood. Shop owners, workers, and families. Many of them had cybernetic enhancements, but nothing as flashy as Ko Daho's red arm. They were just regular folks trying to make a living in New Seoul. Mr. Washington put on his jacket and headed downstairs. As he approached Mrs. Han's store, he could hear worried voices talking about the Red Dragon Syndicate. His enhanced hearing picked up fragments of conversations. They'll come back. Ko Daho works for them. Nobody stands up to the Red Dragons. Mrs. Han was standing in front of her store, trying to calm people down. When she saw Mr. Washington approaching, relief showed on her face. "Mr. Washington," she called out. "Please, can you help? Everyone is scared. The Red Dragons. They've been sending messages to all the businesses in the area." Mr. Washington walked through the crowd. People stepped aside respectfully, many of them nodding to him. He wasn't just the quiet old man anymore. Now they saw him differently. "What kind of messages?" he asked Mrs. Han. A young shop owner with basic cybernetic eyes stepped forward. "They say they're coming to collect what's theirs. They say nobody disrespects their soldiers and gets away with it." Mr. Washington looked at the worried faces around him. These people reminded him of the villagers he had protected in Vietnam so many years ago. Different time, different place, but the same fear of bullies and thugs. "The Red Dragons are just people," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the crowd. "They're not gods or demons. They're just people who think being strong means they can hurt others. But they have the newest cybernetics," someone in the crowd said. "Military-grade stuff, they say." Mr. Washington almost smiled at that. If they only knew what real military-grade enhancements could do. His systems were analyzing the crowd even as he stood there, tracking movement patterns, identifying potential threats, running combat scenarios. But he kept his voice calm and gentle. "Let me tell you something about military grade," he said. "In Vietnam, we didn't have fancy cybernetics. We had mud and blood and courage. We protected each other. We stood together." He looked around at the faces watching him. "That's what this neighborhood needs to do. Stand together." A police car descended from the sky lanes and landed nearby. Captain Kim Sun-mei stepped out, her official cybernetic badge glowing on her chest. She walked through the crowd toward Mr. Washington. "Mr. Washington," she said formally, "we need to talk about what happened with Ko Daho." The crowd went quiet. Everyone knew the police usually stayed away from Red Dragon business. Some people said the dragons had bought them off. Others said the police were just too scared to interfere. But Captain Kim was different. Her cybernetic enhancements were minimal, just what she needed for police work. She believed in doing things the old way, with hard work and honest commitment. "Of course, Captain," Mr. Washington replied. "Would you like some tea? Mrs. Han makes the best tea in New Seoul." Inside the store, Captain Kim got straight to the point. Kodaho is in custody, she said. His arm's power coupling was damaged in a way I've never seen before. Clean, precise, no collateral damage. She looked at Mr. Washington carefully. That's not civilian work. Mr. Washington sipped his tea. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways, he said simply. The Red Dragons are claiming you assaulted their man without provocation. There were witnesses. Yes, Captain Kim nodded. And they all say the same thing. That you gave him every chance to walk away. That you used minimal force. She paused. That you showed more mercy than they would have. Outside, the crowd was still gathering. More people were arriving, drawn by the police car, and the rumors spreading through the neighborhood. Here's the thing, Mr. Washington, Captain Kim continued. We found something interesting when we scanned Kodaho's cybernetics, the power source for his plasma cutter. It's military grade, not the civilian stuff he claimed it was. Mr. Washington's enhanced systems immediately made the connection. Someone selling military hardware to street gangs. Exactly. And not just any military hardware. We're talking about advanced stuff. Almost as good as, she stopped, looking at him thoughtfully. Almost as good as what they gave to Vietnam veterans in the enhancement program. Mr. Washington set down his teacup. His enhanced hearing was picking up movement outside. Multiple vehicles landing in the sky lanes above the store. His combat systems were starting threat assessments before he even consciously registered the danger. They're coming, he said quietly. Captain Kim's hand went to her service weapon. Who's coming? The Red Dragons. They're landing on the roof of the building across the street. 2 more groups coming down the alley behind the store. He stood up slowly. They're not here to talk, Captain. How can you know all that? Captain Kim asked, but her voice suggested she already knew the answer. Because my enhancements aren't almost as good as Vietnam veteran gear, Mr. Washington said. They are Vietnam veteran gear, and they're telling me we have about 2 minutes before things get very interesting. Mrs. Han, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. What should we do? Mr. Washington looked at the crowd outside the store. They were scared, but they were still there. They hadn't run away. Just like those villagers in Vietnam, so long ago. People who just wanted to live their lives in peace, but who were willing to stand together when they had to. Captain, he said, how do you feel about doing things the old way? Before all these fancy cybernetics. Captain Kim smiled slightly. I always did prefer the classics. Mrs. Han, there's a basement under your store, isn't there? Yes, for storage. Good. Get everyone inside and down there. The Red Dragons want to make an example of this neighborhood. Mr. Washington straightened his jacket. Let's give them a lesson they won't forget. His combat systems were lighting up with threat assessments and tactical auctions, but underneath all the military hardware and enhanced reflexes, something else was awakening. Something that had nothing to do with cybernetics or neural processors. The old warrior spirit that had carried him through the jungles of Vietnam was stirring again. His enhanced eyes picked up the first Red Dragon enforcers appearing on the rooftop across the street. They had new cybernetics, shiny and powerful, but they didn't have what he had. They didn't have 50 years of combat experience. They didn't have the discipline learned in the mud and blood of real war. And most importantly, they didn't have something worth fighting for. Mr. Washington did. He had this neighborhood, these people, this little piece of peace he had helped protect. Time to teach the dragons about real military grade, he said quietly. The war that had started in a jungle so many years ago was about to continue in the streets of New Seoul, and this time, the old soldier wasn't fighting alone. The Red Dragon enforcers moved like shadows across the rooftops of New Seoul. Their cybernetic enhancements gleamed in the morning sun as they positioned themselves around Mrs. Han's store. They thought they had the advantage of surprise. They were wrong. Mr. Washington stood calmly in the middle of the store. His enhanced vision tracked 27 Red Dragon members taking positions outside. His military systems identified their weapons. Plasma cutters, shock beacons, and neural disruptors. All illegal military-grade hardware. Captain Kim Sun-mei crouched behind the counter, her service weapon ready. "I've called for backup," she whispered. "But it will take time." "Time," Mr. Washington said quietly, "is something I have plenty of." His enhanced hearing picked up the sound of heavy footsteps approaching the front door. "Mrs. Han, are the civilians secure in the basement?" Mrs. Han nodded. "Everyone is down there. But Mr. Washington, there are so many of them outside." "Numbers don't win battles," he replied. "I learned that in Vietnam." His combat systems were already calculating defensive positions and escape routes. "Captain, when this starts, stay with Mrs. Han. Protect the civilians." "What about you?" Mr. Washington smiled slightly. "I'm going to give these young people a history lesson." The front door burst open. 5 Red Dragon enforcers rushed in, their cybernetic improvements humming with power. Their leader, a tall woman with silver cyber arms, pointed at Mr. Washington. "This is the one," she said. "The old man who damaged Ko Daho's arm." Mr. Washington looked at each enforcer carefully. Their movements showed their inexperience. They relied too much on their enhancements, not enough on real skill. "Young lady," he said politely, "I suggest you and your friends leave this neighborhood. There's no profit for you here." The woman laughed. "Profit? This isn't about profit, old man. This is about respect. No one disrespects the Red Dragons. Respect," Mr. Washington said, "is earned, not taken." His enhanced eyes noticed something interesting about their cybernetics. All of them used the same power frequency. Amateur work. The woman raised her cyber arm, which transformed into a neural disruptor. "The Red Dragons own this city. Time to learn your place, old man." "I learned my place a long time ago," Mr. Washington replied. "In a jungle far from here. Fighting people who thought having better weapons made them better warriors." He moved before she could fire. His enhanced reflexes, honed by decades of combat experience, let him flow between the enforcers like water. His military-grade systems detected the frequency of their cyber weapons and transmitted a precise counter-signal. Their expensive enhancements suddenly stopped working. The woman with silver arms stared in shock as her neural disruptor powered down. "What did you?" Mr. Washington's hand moved in a blur, striking pressure points that his combat systems had identified. The woman dropped to the floor, unconscious but unhurt. The other enforcers backed away, their useless cybernetics hanging heavy on their bodies. "First lesson," Mr. Washington said. "Technology is a tool, not a crutch." Outside, more Red Dragon members were moving in. Their heavy footsteps echoed through the street as they surrounded the store. Mr. Washington could hear their weapons powering up. "Captain," he called out, "get ready. They're about to." The windows exploded inward as neural pulse grenades flew into the store. But Mr. Washington was already moving. His enhanced systems calculated the grenades' trajectories instantly. He caught 2 of them and threw them back outside before they could detonate. The third he simply stepped on, his military-grade shielding absorbing the neural pulse. "Second lesson," he said to the stunned enforcers. "Never use weapons you don't fully understand." The neural pulses detonated outside, disabling several Red Dragon members who were preparing to storm the store. Their expensive cybernetics shorted out, leaving them confused and vulnerable. More enforcers rushed in through the broken windows. They moved fast, their cyber-enhanced muscles giving them incredible speed. But to Mr. Washington's experienced eyes, they looked like children playing at war. He met them with the calm efficiency that had kept him alive in Vietnam. His movements were precise, calculated by decades of combat experience and enhanced by military-grade systems that were far superior to their street-level hardware. One by one, the Red Dragon enforcers fell, some to precise strikes that disabled their cybernetics, others to pressure point techniques that their neural processors couldn't predict. Mr. Washington never used more force than necessary, never caused more harm than needed to stop them. "Third lesson," he said as he worked. A true warrior knows when not to kill. In the middle of the fight, his enhanced hearing picked up a familiar voice outside. Kodaho had returned, his red cybernetic arm now repaired. He was shouting at his fellow Red Dragon members. "Stop. All of you stop." The remaining enforcers hesitated. Kodaho pushed through them and entered the store. His red cyber arm hung at his side, powered down. "Mr. Washington," he said, his voice different from before. The arrogance was gone. "Please, this has gone too far." Mr. Washington looked at the young man carefully. His combat systems detected no immediate threat. "You broke out of custody," he observed. "Yes, when I heard they were coming after you, after this neighborhood." Kodaho looked around at his fallen companions. "I had to try to stop it." "Why?" "Because you were right. About strength, about purpose." Kodaho stepped forward. "I've been thinking about what you said, about building things, protecting things." Outside, police sirens began to wail. Captain Kim's backup was finally arriving. The remaining Red Dragon enforcers started to retreat, leaving their disabled companions behind. "The Red Dragons gave us power," Kodaho continued. "But you showed us what real strength is." He looked at his red cyber arm. "These enhancements, they're stolen military gear, aren't they?" "Yes," Mr. Washington said. "Copied badly from veteran technology. Dangerous copies. That's why you could shut them down so easily." Kodaho smiled slightly. "The Red Dragons told us we had the best technology in the city. But you're the real thing, aren't you? A real enhanced veteran." Mr. Washington nodded. "One of the last." Police vehicles were landing outside. Officers in tactical gear began securing the area. Captain Kim emerged from behind the counter, already coordinating with her reinforcements. "It's over," she said. "We're arresting all Red Dragon members in the area. Their leadership has been compromised." Turns out they were selling defective military hardware. Very illegal. Kodaho straightened his shoulders. "I'll tell you everything I know about their operation, about the stolen technology." He looked at Mr. Washington. If that would help protect the neighborhood." Mr. Washington studied the young man's face. His enhanced systems detected sincerity in Kodaho's voice patterns, genuine remorse in his body language. "Fourth lesson," he said quietly. "It's never too late to choose a better path." The sun was rising higher over New Seoul, its light reflecting off the broken glass that littered Mrs. Han's store. In the basement, the civilians were emerging, led by Mrs. Han herself. They looked around in amazement at the disabled Red Dragon enforcers, at the police securing the scene, at the old black man who stood calmly in the middle of it all. Mr. Washington's military systems began powering down from combat mode. The fight was over, but perhaps something more important had begun. "Captain," he said, "I believe Kodaho has something to tell you about the Red Dragon's operations." As Kodaho began talking to Captain Kim, Mr. Washington walked over to help Mrs. Han clean up the broken glass. His enhanced eyes caught sight of his reflection in a surviving window pane. He saw what he had always seen, not a superhuman warrior, not a living weapon, but simply an old soldier who had found a new way to serve. The war in Vietnam had ended long ago, but the duty to protect, to teach, to help others find their better nature, that duty never ended. And as Mr. Washington began picking up the pieces of Mrs. Han's store, he knew he wouldn't want it any other way. 3 months had passed since the confrontation with the Red Dragons. New Seoul's spring brought warm sunshine and gentle breezes to the city streets. Mr. Washington sat in his usual spot at Mrs. Han's store, drinking his morning tea. His enhanced eyes watched the neighborhood coming to life around him. The store looked different now. Mrs. Han had used the insurance money to modernize it, but she kept the old-fashioned tea section just the way it was. She said some things were better left unchanged. The bell above the door chimed. Kodaho walked in, his red cybernetic arm now painted a simple black. He wasn't alone. Behind him came 5 other young people, all former Red Dragon members who had chosen to follow his example. "Good morning, Mr. Washington," Kodaho said respectfully. "Are we too early for today's lesson?" Mr. Washington checked his internal clock, a habit from his military days. "Right on time," he said. "Mrs. Han has the back room ready." After the incident, Kodaho had helped Captain Kim break up the Red Dragon's illegal weapons operation. Instead of prison, he and several other young gang members had been given a chance to reform. Part of their rehabilitation involved learning from Mr. Washington. The back room of Mrs. Han's store had become an unofficial community center. Mr. Washington taught there 3 times a week, sharing his knowledge with former gang members and neighborhood youth. Not just combat skills, but the wisdom he had gained in his long life. Today's students settled onto cushions on the floor. Their cybernetic enhancements have been modified by legitimate doctors, transformed from weapons into tools for peaceful work. Kodaho now used his arm's precision for electronic repair. Others had found similar productive uses for their technology. Today, Mr. Washington said, "We're going to talk about something important." He looked at each student in turn. The difference between power and strength. One of the younger students, a girl named Min, raised her hand. Her neural implants now helped her study medicine instead of hacking security systems. "Is this about the Vietnam War, sir?" Mr. Washington smiled. "In a way. But it's about more than that." He settled into his teaching chair, a comfortable old thing that Mrs. Han had insisted on buying for him. "It's about what I learned there, and what I'm still learning here." His enhanced systems automatically adjusted the room's lighting and temperature for optimal learning conditions, but the wisdom he shared came from his human experiences, not his cybernetic upgrades. "In Vietnam," he continued, "we faced an enemy with better weapons, better supply lines, better everything. But we had something they didn't have." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We had purpose. We were fighting to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." Kodaho nodded slowly. "Like what you did for Mrs. Han." "Exactly. Power is easy to get. You can buy it, steal it, or take it by force. But strength." Mr. Washington tapped his chest. "Strength comes from here. From knowing why you fight, why you live, why you choose to use whatever power you have." Another student, Park Jun, spoke up. His cybernetic legs now helped him work as a delivery man instead of a street fighter. "Is that why you didn't kill any of us during the fight, even though you could have?" "That's right. Real strength includes mercy. The power to hurt is nothing special. The strength to help, to protect, to show mercy when you could show force. That's what makes a warrior." The lesson continued through the morning. Mr. Washington shared stories from Vietnam, but also from his years in New Seoul. He taught them about honor, about community, about finding purpose in life. His enhanced memory could recall every detail perfectly, but he chose to tell the stories simply, focusing on their meaning rather than their details. Outside, the neighborhood had changed too. After the Red Dragons were driven out, other veterans had emerged from retirement. They formed a community watch program, using their enhanced abilities to protect rather than fight. Captain Kim worked closely with them, creating a new model of community policing that other districts wanted to copy. As the lesson ended, Kodaho stayed behind. "Mr. Washington," he said, "I've been thinking about what you taught us about purpose. Oh, I want to start a program for young people thinking about joining gangs." Kodaho's face showed determination. "Show them there's a better way to use technology, a better way to live." Mr. Washington studied the young man. His enhanced systems could detect no deception, only genuine commitment. "That sounds like a good purpose," he said. Would you help me? Be an advisor?" Before Mr. Washington could answer, Mrs. Han called from the store. "Mr. Washington, you have visitors." 2 men entered the back room. Their movements, their posture, the way their eyes scanned the room, Mr. Washington recognized fellow veterans immediately. His systems confirmed it. They had the same type of enhancements he did. "James Washington." One of them said, "I'm Michael Chen." This is Robert Martinez. We served in Nam too. Different units, same war. We heard about what you did here, Martine said. About how you're teaching these kids, using what we learned back then to help people now. Chen nodded. There aren't many of us left. But maybe we could help too. Mr. Washington looked at Ko Daho, then at his fellow veterans. His enhanced systems were already calculating possibilities, ways to expand the program, ways to help more young people. I think, he said slowly, we're about to start something important. 1 month later, the back room had become too small. They moved the classes to a proper community center, funded by local businesses and supported by the city government. Veterans from different wars taught there, sharing their experiences and wisdom with young people who wanted to learn. Mr. Washington still spent his mornings at Mrs. Hand's store, drinking tea and watching the neighborhood. But now he saw more than just the present. He saw the future taking shape, a future where the lessons of the past helped guide new generations. His enhanced eyes could zoom in on the smallest details, but what made him smile was the big picture. Former gang members working honest jobs, young people learning from old warriors, veterans finding new ways to serve. The war in Vietnam had ended long ago, but its lessons lived on in New Seoul, taught by an old soldier who had found a new mission. Mr. Washington's military systems might keep his body young, but it was his human heart that kept his spirit strong. And every morning, as he sat drinking his tea and waiting for his students to arrive, he remembered what he had learned in that distant jungle. That true strength wasn't in the weapons you carried or the enhancements you wore, but in the choices you made and the people you protected. In the end, that was the most important lesson of all.